Yeah, we're not talking about a Creole leader. We're talking about Dom Pedro I, the son of the Portuguese king, who had been living in Brazil for years anyways because Napoleon had been running roughshod over Portugal and everywhere else. So Brazil is going to have a different experience. Everywhere else, though, there's a revolt. Spain is overthrown. There's a brief attempt to install a monarchy, but they don't succeed, and you end up with a republic. And you should put republic in quotation marks probably, because I'm not sure exactly how Republican they were, because there are going to be a lot of issues with dealing with social and economic issues for the average person. Remember, the average person living in Latin America was not a Creole. He was an Indian or a mestizo, or in some places an African slave. Those people aren't going to have representation, at least not evenly, for a long time. So, they have the same, these same ideas that helped inspire the American Revolution, if you think about it. Remember, the Declaration of Independence is a reworking of John Locke's Second Treatise on Government. But we also know that Latin American history plays out differently than the United States. The Latin American countries do not become Spanish-speaking countries that are just like the U.S., except they speak Spanish. They're very different. And part of that reason, or maybe the main reason, is their colonial experience was different. Being a British colony was very different than being a Spanish colony. So, next slide. When you say somebody carries a lot of baggage, what do you mean? Yeah, past problems that they bring with them. Very good. Yep. Some colonial baggage is going to plague the Latin American countries. And one of them is there's no tradition of participation amongst the people. See, it's easier for the United States to transition to a constitutional republic because the average American man, was used to participating in government. You had, who passed laws that counted in Virginia? The Virginia House of Burgesses. It was the General Court of Massachusetts in Massachusetts. You had relative local autonomy for most of the English colonial experience. So, participation for these people, for Americans, there was no doubt about it. There was no question over whether a white man who owned property would be able, a minimal amount of property would be able to vote. That was taken for granted. But you didn't have elections in New Spain. You didn't have elections in Peru. How did the Spanish run their empire? What?
Oh, the vice.
They had a hierarchical structure with viceroys who answered directly to the king, and then viceroys had governors who answered to that, but the governors weren't elected. Okay, it's almost the way the setup kind of reminds me of like the setup of the Catholic Church. You got the Pope who places archbishops in different archdioceses, and the archbishops oversee parish priests who oversee the congregation. And Catholics don't get to make decisions on church policy. The Pope doesn't call me up and say, hey, what should we do about this? Heck, my congregation at St. Thecla doesn't even get asked if we're going to get a new, you want a new priest? We just all of a sudden find out, whoa, we've got a new priest. Yeah, we've been through like 5 priests in 10 years.
Well, we had one that quit because
what?
Father Charles.
Father Charles? I like Father Charles.
I know, he had to go on a month of isolation because of us.
Look, what?
What'd you guys do to him?
Not us, like the parish, people the parish, wrote letters, mean letters to him. He went to a month of isolation, no talking, because of something we did. We went to 5 other priests.
Anyways, all right. Anyways, this is going to be a problem then. You get independence, but there's no tradition of political participation among the population. So even though we're going to see republics declared, they aren't as democratic as you would assume they would be. Class divisions in Latin America were much more extreme. Remember, in the Americas, there were no titled nobility. You know, if you were an English duke, you didn't move to New York, for God's sakes. In America, there were rich people, there were poor people. But overall, in terms of social class, most Americans were middling farmers or shopkeepers. There weren't huge divisions. But in the Spanish colonies, you would have a massive amount of power and wealth in the hands of very few people. You know, you think back, that was the old Spanish model. That's the way they intended it. And when they created that encomienda system, you know, and Peninsulares had the most power. Over time, Creoles will outnumber Peninsulares, and wealth and power will be concentrated in them. But for the average person, not so much. This will be a long, lingering problem in Latin America. Those class divisions also tend to be racial. Were racial matters, did they play a role in American class system, the United States?
Yes.
Yeah,
But
to
not
an
to
extent. I mean, slaves, right? African Americans.
The other races didn't
The
have money.
thing is, Africans never accounted for the majority in the United States. But in the Latin American countries, the mixed race and the Indians were the majority. So that's going to be some baggage that they carry into it. So the average person in New Spain is politically dependent. They're not used to equality and participating in government. They're economically dependent. They don't own the land that they work. And socially, they're prevented from moving up. You can't alter your race. Michael Jackson tried. I think actually Michael Jackson tried to alter his species. He didn't even look human anymore.
He succeeded.
But Peter Pan wasn't human, that's what he was going after, so I can't believe. Oh, that's so creepy.
Isn't it weird how
All right.
does look like a little kid?
Next.
Mr. Crompton, what did you say was the
Oh, the average person in Latin America. See, this is a difference with the United States. Remember, the average American, when we achieved our independence, owned his own land and was an independent farmer. But in Mexico or Venezuela, in any of those places, the average person wasn't a middle-class landowner, in charge of himself. He was reliant on the wealthy who owned all the land. It almost sounds, in some ways, it should sound to you, remind you of feudalism. Now, the Revolution. There were 4 key external events that will help inspire them. First, the American Revolution. Don't think that the Creoles in Latin America weren't paying attention when the gringos up north got tired of their oppressive government, got tired of serving the mother country instead of being able to take care of themselves, said no more, fought for independence, and won. Wow. When that's a success story, and when you hear that kind of story, you think, maybe we can do that. The French Revolution follows about 15 years after the American Revolution starts, 1789, right? So, in the French Revolution, you see common people rising up. I mean, heck, they kill their king. And they make attempts to dramatically alter society. But remember, the French Revolution had its different stages. It had its liberal stage and its radical stage. Which stage appealed to the Creoles in the
Liberal.
The liberal. Yeah, radical revolution would have been very bad for the Creoles because that would have meant they lose their power, wealth, prestige, and possibly heads. The Haitian Revolution, which was a little closer to home for Latin Americans, had to raise some eyebrows. The Haitian Revolution was different from the American and French in what way?
Slaves.
It was a slave revolt. Toussaint l'Ouverture, or whatever, right?
All same.
Now, it's going to matter. I mean, in some areas in Latin America, you have large numbers of slaves. You have large numbers of people who are close to slaves. And the idea of the oppressed majority rising up and taking vengeance, it's appealing. But also the French conquest of Spain is going to influence things. Remember, France conquered darn near every European country. Which European country did they not? They didn't take Britain, and they couldn't hold Russia. But pretty much everything else between, they took out. And Napoleon overthrew the Spanish king and installed his own brother as king of Spain. Now you have an issue for the Creoles in the Spanish Empire. Your allegiance, are you loyal to a French king of Spain? No. So briefly there's going to be a period where the political connection between the empire and the fatherland or motherland, whichever gender you want to use, it's severed. And it's kind of, you know, if you think about it, Napoleon's doing this in the 1808 through, I mean, he's done in 1815. The revolutions come shortly after that. So this was obviously, or likely, very important. There's definitely a positive correlation. But we also know from our areas of study that things like this don't happen only because of external forces. Internal problems bring down an empire. Internal problems weaken the empire from the center and make it vulnerable to external forces. Well, internal problems in Latin America, one of the main ones is the Creoles aren't happy. They're not happy about their glass ceiling. It's a glass ceiling. What?
Something that did not allow certain people to go any higher than what.
Yeah, they can't go any higher up in terms of prestige and stuff because they're born in the Americas. That doesn't seem right to them.
So limit to social class?
Yeah, there's limits to their mobility.
Wait, why is it glass?
These are wealthy people, most of them. They definitely feel important. I mean, they are European, which makes them better than the regular people as far as they were concerned. But simply because of where they were born, they are, you know, they don't have the same privileges as these people who come over from Spain. And that's irritating. Isn't it irritating when someone else gets special treatment at your expense? If you have siblings, it's always irritating you. Like, that's not fair. If I pick up a Slurpee for my daughter, I better pick one up for my sons.
They're American born.
Otherwise, they get very angry, right?
Can't move. Like, they can only move so far.
Creoles resent new taxes. No one likes new taxes.
Because
Trade restrictions.
American born.
Yeah.
Why were there trade restrictions in Latin America?
So they can only trade with the mother country?
That's right. Mercantilism, to limit trade for one purpose only, to benefit the crown. Listen, when I go into business, if I were to start a business, I do not go in business so that the federal government can get more money from me in taxes. I risk my life savings to invest in a business so that I profit. And if the government does things to limit my ability to profit, I'm going to be irritated. And I will take steps, I will try to change that. Yeah.
Is that like in the American? Is that like?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it irritated Americans with controlling tea. I mean, you had a monopoly with the British East India Company.
I mean, when they put up.
Iron Act, Hat Act, all those different things. Also, remember those reforms of the 18th century? Remember reading about those a little while ago?
The Borburn
They didn't
one?
address what?
The Borburn one?
Yeah, they didn't address the real issues. Okay? Actually, in some cases, aggravated the issue. So there's a lot of resentment from this ruling class in Latin America. And remember, these are liberal, they have liberal ideas, not radical ideas. Next, please. Another difference between the American Revolution and the revolutions in Latin America. The American colonies, well, 13 of them, I should say, unite. The Canadian ones don't join us. But in Latin America, there's not union. I mean, Mexico doesn't ally with Gran Colombia. They don't form together. And even these groups, Mexico, originally the United Provinces of Central America had been part of Mexico, but they separate. Gran Colombia separates into
Ecuador, Venezuela, and Argentina?
Colombia.
Or Colombia.
Yeah. And Rio de la Plata, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. I mean, they're not united. And our sensibilities tell us they should be. They should be. I mean, they're all former Spanish colonies. They have the same language. They worship the same God in the same way because they're Roman Catholic. Why don't they come together in these endeavors?
Because when they were colonies, they were separated.
Yeah, I mean, infrastructure, these people, they didn't feel connected, and the regional forces, the powerful people in the various regions, realize that a larger union will be at their expense. So, and that you're going to find this constant struggle between the desire to centralize power in a country versus a more federal system where power is distributed amongst the regions. That's a common theme for Latin America during this time, is that conflict. I touched on all of those. So, good. Next. Let's look at Mexico. We're actually going to, there's a couple slides dedicated to Mexico. What was Father Miguel de Hidalgo's mistake?
Trying to align with all the Indians and stuff.
He aligned with mestizos and Indians, which would be the majority of Mexicans. The problem is he does not have support of the Creoles then, because they distrust the mestizos and the Indians. You know, and there's a racial component to that. There's also, if you've been holding these people down for so long and you give them power, they might use that power to exact revenge against you. So, I mean, I don't know how many of you have any knowledge about what went on in Zimbabwe in the last 25 years, or 30 years. But Zimbabwe had originally been Rhodesia, and it had been an English settler colony. And in the 1970s, Zimbabwe was called the breadbasket of Africa. It had many, many productive farms. But the vast majority of those farms were owned by Englishmen. It wasn't an English colony anymore. But the English had the economic power there. And around 1980 or so, when Robert Mugabe seized power, he began seizing land from white settlers, from whites. And we can't even call them settlers anymore. They had been born there, and they inherited the farm from someone else. Began seizing them and giving them to, well, the argument was to the people of Zimbabwe, but instead he was giving it to his political allies and stuff. But, revenge. And there wasn't much that the settlers could do about it, that the whites could do about it. I think that the Creoles were afraid of the same thing. Like Southerners, it wasn't just an economic issue if you ended slavery. I mean, that's going to hurt them economically. What are the political implications then? If these people, are we going to make them citizens and they can vote? Good God, they might have a bone to pick with us if we let them vote. So the Creoles distrust the mestizos because they think that'll lead to social revolution. They want political revolution. They want to take political power for themselves. They do not want to drastically change society. They don't want a French Revolution. They want an American Revolution. So the Creoles are liberal. They're not radical. Father Miguel de Hidalgo probably teetered toward the radical side, which is why in the end he's arrested and executed. Augustine Iturbide, I don't know how to say his last name in Spanish. We'll just call him Augie. Will proclaim himself emperor in 1821, and it looks like Mexico's going to have a monarchy. But, remember, the influence from the Enlightenment, the monarchy does not last, and in 1824, Mexico has a constitution, a federalist constitution, a federal constitution that I don't know much about, to be honest with you, but it must have been pretty acceptable to liberals. I know when the Texans fought for their independence against Mexico, initially it was a rebellion to defend the Mexican Constitution from the caudillo Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. They were defending the Mexican Constitution, which had been hijacked. But so Mexico decides to go in the way of republic. There's going to be a constant struggle, though, over who's in charge and whose interest does the government represent. I mean, even when I was your age, there were rebellions and fighting going on in the Mexican state of Chiapas. It's in southeastern Mexico. The majority of the population is Indian, Mexican Indian. And it was the poorest region in Mexico. They had no political clout, and they were fighting because of it. They wanted something. So this will be a long-standing conflict and problem for Mexico. Next. As I mentioned about Central America, originally been part of Mexico, but factionalism and different regional powers that don't want to lose their clout, they break away, and now, I mean, there's no united Central America. It seems like they could be, but you know what? There are different nationalities. A Honduran is not a Nicaraguan, and they, you know, would probably get upset if you told them, nah, you're pretty much the same thing, aren't you? It's like telling a Belgian French. Yeah, they get pissed and then they won't make waffles.
Those are really good.
Next. Gran Colombia. This name is important. Simón Bolívar. They named a country after him. Bolivia. Very good. There's not too many countries that get named after people. Colombia, I guess. Columbus.
America, yeah.
America, okay. Good. But we're the United States of America. You can name count. But overall, you don't get a lot of countries named after people. So, yeah, obviously this guy was pretty important.
People's Republic of China.
Bolivar is interesting to me because he had the opportunity to become an emperor and he turned it down. He's very clearly following in that Enlightenment model. He's kind of like the Latin American George Washington in that sense. He helped secure the independence of Gran Colombia. But once independence is achieved, there's almost immediately there's infighting. And there's that one quote in your book where he complains that America is ungovernable. And, you know, it doesn't stick together. After his death, everything breaks apart. You get Venezuela separate from Colombia, separate from Ecuador. And there's still occasionally hostilities between Colombia and Venezuela. I'm not exactly sure what their disputes are. But, anyways, next. Rio de la Plata. Think Argentina here. You know, and if you really want to think of the three important places we're going to look at, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. All right. With Rio de la Plata, we're talking further down into South America. We're talking about José de San Martín. One of the major grievances for this area were trade restrictions. Buenos Aires was a commercial center, and trade restrictions hurt its merchant class, yeah.
Oh, I was just looking up countries and Philippines together.
Oh, good call.
Of Spain.
Yep, you are right.
Cool beans.
Argentina, modern day Argentina, then called Buenos Aires, the city there, is really the powerhouse we're talking about. But Paraguay, Uruguay, and Upper Peru, which is now Bolivia, they don't want to be under the thumb of Buenos Aires. So this breaks up into different parts also. So while the American colonies unite into the United States, the Latin American colonies seem to do the opposite. They separately fight for their independence, and then once they get their independence, they fragment even more. Yeah.
How did Bolivia come from like part of Argentina? They got Simon Bolivar's name.
They just named it after him because they like him. He was an inspiring fellow for Latin Americans.
Isn't there like our Bolivia and then because isn't Venezuela called like the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela or something?
Is it? It could be.
Is there like a difference?
Yes.
Okay.
Venezuela is here.
Yeah.
Bolivia is here.
Oh.
Wait, so bottom part of Peru is still Peru, but top part is not Bolivia?
Bolivia is south of
No,
Peru.
Peru is right here. Which places are we gonna have to be able to point out on a map? Are there any that we should like know?
If I treat them specially on this, you should know. But I already mentioned that there's three really important ones, right? Hint, hint. All right. By the way, and that revolt will spread then to Chile and regular Peru.
Wait, what?
And by the 1830s, Spain's pretty much lost it. Next. Peru takes a while for the people there to want to revolt, and it makes some sense. Peru was older as a Spanish colony. Remember, that's the seat of where Pizarro took out the Inca. There's more support for the crown in Peru, but not enough. In 1824, the royalists are defeated, and Spain loses Peru as well. This is almost like in the game of Risk when your big choke point gets broken through, and after that, it's just your enemy just starts cleaning house, picking you off one at a time. That's what happens to poor Spain.
1824?
Next. Brazil's different. It's different because it's Portuguese, and it's different because of its experience. Brazil was very conservative. The wealthy and powerful in Brazil were very, very wealthy. So they are going to fear drastic change. If life is already good for you, you probably shouldn't change it, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Correct? And so a lot of people weren't willing to risk political change. That's one thing that people often point out, that our founding fathers were exceptional fellows. George Washington was one of the wealthiest landowners in Virginia. And look at what he was risking. I mean, he could have stayed a wealthy man, without fighting in the rebellion at all. All of these guys that signed the independence were men of means. They weren't poor. What were they risking? Well, it makes sense. Why would you risk that? Where'd you get that? Just say Crossan's room.
Wait, so you're saying they were wealthy and they were risking that?
No, they did. Well, Americans were. These. No, they said.
Oh, they were considered. Oh.
Is Courtney Mays here?
No, she's absent.
Oh shoot! I forgot to mark her absent.
She's absent today. Okay, get back.
Dropped the ball when I asked who's innocent.
Oh.
All right. Anyways, so the Portuguese ruling class, political revolution could be dangerous for them. Yeah, because they got an awful lot to lose. Also, though, Brazil's different because, as we mentioned, the king of Portugal actually lives in Brazil for a while. The entire court moves over to Brazil while Napoleon is causing problems in Europe. So it has a special status. For a while, Brazil isn't treated like a colony that serves Portugal. For a while, Brazil is equal. Yeah, it is Portugal. It's not until Napoleon's defeated that the powers that be in Brazil begin to realize they're going to go back to that secondary status. The revolution in Brazil is not led by Creoles. It's not led by slaves or Indians. It's led by the king's son, Dom Pedro I, who declares Brazil's independence, and that's why they have a monarch. He's not a nobody who makes himself king. He's in the line, he's in the royal line. It's perfectly sensible. The mechanisms for placing him there and giving him the power already exist. So it's not a revolutionary thing. It's not like making that Augustine and Iturbide, making him emperor out of nowhere. It's a sensible thing. Remember we said Brazil was more conservative? Well, as the king's son and now the king of emperor of Brazil, he's going to maintain the existing order, the way things are. Conservatives want to conserve the status quo. They want to keep things the way they are. Yes?
What's a constitutional emperor, as opposed to like a regular?
Good question. A constitutional emperor accepts limits to his power. Whereas an autocratic emperor would have no legal limits to his power. He could pretty much do whatever he wanted. With the freshmen, we were talking about the Abbasid Empire. Legally, there was no power over the caliph. There were no checks on his power at all, and there actually existed the office of the royal executioner, which was symbolic. If you make the caliph angry, he can have you executed. You don't need trial. Ha ha ha. Nope. Trials, rules, stuff like that. That's what its constitution is for. So in that sense, if it becomes a constitutional emperor, there is a bit of a enlightened aspect to his reign. So anyway. Next.
Mr. Crossan?
Yes.
Wasn't it Dom Pedro II, not the first?
Was it?
I think it was.
They're both.
No,
Pedro the First. It was his third.
Well, who was his father? His father wasn't Pedro.
Yeah, it was Dom Pedro the First.
Okay, thank you.
Really? I swear I thought it was the second.
Old and new problem. It's going to be a lingering problem in Latin America, the power of the Catholic Church. This is not a religious issue. Guys, this is not, when you talk about the problem with the power of the church, you're not talking about a religious conflict. Latin Americans were intensely Roman Catholic. What's the issue with the Catholic Church?
Separation of the power. Separation of church and state.
Power?
They wanted the church to recognize that they were independent, but the church.
The church does not, the Catholic Church actively opposed liberal reforms. And if you think about it, like we were talking about the Catholic Church structure, it's not a very, it's not authoritarian, it's a hierarchical structure. It doesn't seek the advice of its believers. It has its own councils that are self-perpetuating, and it makes its own decisions, and it rules. And if the Pope says something ex cathedra, that's it. You can't question it. It's law. It's as if Jesus himself said. So the church will, in terms of separation of church and state, the church will try to intervene politically to prevent liberal reforms. It had been doing that in Europe as well. So that will be an old and new problem. Slavery. By 1850, every Latin American country, except for Brazil, was free of slavery. That doesn't mean the legacy of slavery didn't persist as a problem. What's the problem with ending slavery?
What do you do with the slaves?
What do you do with the slaves? Yeah. What's their status? These are republics, right? So do the former slaves get to vote? No. What are their skills? What are they going to do for a living? They have no property. You've given their freedom, but now what do they have? They end up becoming tenant farmers, essentially, working like slaves. Again, the lingering issue of what to do with these people who are at a disadvantage because of this system will continue. Now, even in the United States, we talk about lingering problems with slavery, and you know, a lot of people are like, "Come on, get over it. It's ancient history." Well, not really. 150 years ain't ancient. But, yeah, arguments about, you know, if you look in African American society, there are problems maintaining family structures. The number of single mothers for African American women is huge compared with whites. Some people say that's a legacy of slavery, because in American slavery there was very little value placed towards the family unit. Reproduction was a good business model, and marriage in many cases was actively discouraged. Why would you discourage marriage for your slaves?
You get split up.
Yeah, you got to. Yeah, you can. Yeah, it's in the business of buying and selling people. It might bother you to break up a married couple, but if they're not married,
Too bad.
you can just send them away. Is that a legacy with slavery? It could be. I'm not a sociologist. But then we ask the question, okay, we can't change what happened. What do we do about it now? And the legacy of slavery is going to be an issue that plagues these populations as well. As will be the treatment of Indians and mestizos. What's their status? Remember, for centuries you had a racially segregated social system. Now that we've achieved our independence and we're not part of Spain's empire, what's the status of the majority of the population? Are they going to stay down at the bottom? It's a lingering problem. The limited franchise. You have republics where most people can't vote. What's the problem with extending the franchise, though? It's a threat to the powers that be. So you have that struggle. Now, how democratic is the history of Latin America? It's tough to say. Mexico, for almost the entire 20th century, had one political party in power, the PRI. A one-party system. So when you vote, do you really have a choice?
Do you even vote?
Yeah, you could vote. Yeah, but it'd be like me saying, do you vote for coffee or coffee? Cast your vote. I could say it's a democracy of the right to vote, but what's your choice, really? And then as far as the other Latin American countries, the United States foreign policy, if you read at the end of the chapter, and we will again take a look, United States foreign policy, if a Latin American government, a democratically elected government, did not reflect the interests of American business, we intervened and overthrew them. So that will be an issue. Social status of women will be a lingering issue. Remember, the Spanish changed things when they brought their Iberian system of patriarchy. In the 19th century, Romanticism will encourage Native Americans to celebrate their local customs and stuff. And there's going to be this conflict over the status of women. And yeah.
Would women be considered a social class, and if so, who would they be, like, would they be higher than slaves and mestizos, or would they be somewhere in the middle?
You wouldn't call them a social class.
But
The idea is that women were subordinate to men. And the issue is going to be how subordinate should they be? What legal rights should they have? Should they have the right to inherit property? Should they have the right, can they secure divorces? Can they, what businesses, what opportunities are available to them? Initially, none, because the patriarchal system was very strong. But over time, certain barriers begin to break down. It's slow, but it happens. The other problem is going to be regional fragmentation. Instead of a united Latin America, you have 18 new countries. And sometimes they're at odds with each other. All right, next. Latin American politics. Caudillos is an important term. Those were the local strongmen who, in many cases, subverted what we would call democracy. When I see them, I see a throwback to the power of the encomiendas. They control these large areas. They sometimes have a populist appeal to them, and occasionally they get strong enough to intervene in national politics. Latin American politics sees the constant struggle between centralizers who want power from the capital versus liberals who want a federal system where power is distributed throughout the area. These conflicts will create long-standing instability. Presidents change, constitutions change, there's conflict, civil war, and political stability causes instability causes economic problems, as we'll take a look at. But ultimately, one of the big issues is going to be a distrust of the majority of the population. You can't extend political power to the common man if you don't trust the common man. Next. The economies. Hey, what's up, Robin?
So I was cross out with that, but I just came in to check to see when I should schedule my EE meeting or whatever.
Write it on the calendar out there.
Oh, okay.
I have third block off every day and first block off on 8 days.
And what I just like prepare for you.
It says what to do on the website.
Okay.
But yeah, we're going to be looking for a refined question and making sure that it meets all the criteria.
Okay.
All right. Remember, the Latin American economies have been established by the Spaniards for the service of Spain, which meant restrictions on who you could trade with. When these places secure their independence, Britain and the United States will together...
She's sick, so I'm going to get on this.
Okay. Hope you feel better. I know how it is to be sick. Huh? You had it worse? No, you're just weaker, that's all.
Oh. She's thinking of a comeback. He's just staring at me. He's just staring at me.
Why do Britain and the United States want free trade with these places?
So they can trade with them.
Yeah, access to the raw materials. In the early 20th century, South America, I think to this day, they're the world's largest supplier of rubber. And when the auto industry kicks off, all of a sudden there's a new massive demand for rubber. Tires, right? So it's a source of raw materials. The United States will draft the Monroe Doctrine, and the British will support it and one of the main reasons was to protect our economic interests in the area. What did the Monroe Doctrine say?
Don't come back.
Reagan? Reagan? No, go ahead.
Wasn't it that you couldn't cross a certain point? Am I thinking something?
You're thinking of the proclamation of 1763. Jasmine, what was it?
Europeans couldn't come back and settle in Latin America.
That's right.
It's just funny because
Europeans will no longer intervene in North and South American politics. America is the land of Americans. Similarly, the United States will not intervene in European disputes. Europe is for European, America is for America. We're Americans. You mess with, if you try to take back any of these colonies, we will stop you. And there was a real fear that Europeans would try to take back the colonies, because if you think about, remember the Congress of Vienna? Clement von Metternich and them trying to restore Europe to what it looked like before Napoleon, to restore the monarchies, to bring back the Bourbon dynasty to France and so forth. What's going to stop them from restoring Mexico and all that back to Spain? The U.S. and Britain will. And the U.S. and Britain will do it partially because it makes good money sense for us. In Latin American economies, wealth and prestige were tied to land ownership. That wasn't a change. The vast majority of arable soil, of land that was useful for production of crops and so forth, was owned by relatively few people. Latin American economies will struggle when there is political instability. Political instability discourages investment, because your investments may not be safe. What's an area of the world right now where you wouldn't want to invest in a business? Yeah?
Syria.
Syria. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to open up a window factory in Damascus, because I think my windows might get broken.
That's terrible.
Yeah, I'm not going to start a business in Damascus right now. I'm not going to start a business in Kabul.
Wait, wouldn't people be buying more windows, though? If their windows are constantly getting broken.
I would build them elsewhere and then ship them in.
Because there's so many bombs.
Secretly, Hanses is behind the entire rebellion. Brian Elias is pulling the strings.
Lovely.
Wonderful.
Is that contagious? Because I'm touching a lot of stuff.
Do you need some water? Do you need some water?
No, I'm good.
Are you sure?
Yep. Yeah. All right. So, and we will see that during the time, in the places and the times where there is relative political stability, there will be more prosperity. But so long as things aren't stable, there's no economic growth. And if you think about it, where's an area in the world, we think about Ethiopia in the 1980s was the big, we have to save the Ethiopians and sing "We Are the World," and if we do that, everybody will. Ethiopia was going through a civil war. There was political disruption, economic activity decreased, and you get famine, and you get death. It will also lead to underdeveloped infrastructure. A visual aid here. First, let me have a coffee. All right. I'm going to get my life savings here. 75 cents.
That's a lot of
85, 90, 95.
Wow, Cross, what are you doing?
I have $1.
Woo!
That's right.
Young money.
That's right. I may want to go buy some noodles, a cup of noodles off of Maltop. How much is that going to cost me?
$1.
$1. The problem is, if I spend any of this money on something else, I suddenly now don't have enough to get that. Political instability, civil war and stuff means that money and resources are being directed towards non-productive things, and things like infrastructure that can improve economic activity in people's lives, those get neglected. But in the late 19th century, when things settled down, especially in Brazil and Argentina, you see remarkable economic growth, partially because Britain, Germany, and the United States offer huge markets for the raw materials there. The downside to that is, and you're going to want to read up on this in a little more detail because I don't have time to go over it, but they are a dependent economy. And their entire economy is based on the export of these goods. If demand for these goods falls, the entire economy falls. Remember we saw that with Brazil in the last Latin American chapter we studied. Moving on. All right, Mexico. As I said before, 1824 Federalist Constitution, and the attempt to address liberal reforms. One of the main issues is land distribution. Land distribution it's complicated. I mean, if so much of the land is held by so few, that does not seem fair. But it also doesn't seem fair to take somebody's property and just say, you know what, we're splitting it up and giving it to other people. That seems wrong too. So how do you find an equitable, fair way for those people who, by law, were prevented from opportunities? How do we give them an opportunity without hurting the rights of other people? Yeah?
The people get a lot of land, like have like a lot of it.
Yeah, we're not talking about 160 acres. We're talking about miles in all directions.
Like, did they get it from other people?
Well, they had it from the old system. If you were from an older family there, you would have had more access and owned the best land.
Well, I feel like it's not that unfair if like they have like more land than they could possibly ever need, and then take like a little bit of it. It's not even really their land. Like it's like they
Why isn't it?
inherited it. Like it's not really like they bought it or anything.
If you inherit something, it was your parents. They decided to give it to you. It's
But
yours.
wasn't it taken
That's
in
like
the first
saying you
place?
could
Like,
take it.
yeah, like took it.
It's like you have 20 sweatshirts, like you have like 5 sweatshirts, why don't we take 4 of them and you can survive with 1? That's like a pain in the butt. And
I know, but I mean, I'm not saying like, but I'm saying like, say if I had like 5 sweatshirts and you wanted to take like.
But it's not just 5 sweatshirts, it's like 20,000
Yeah, like I'd be like, all right
Yeah.
then, like if you.
no, I don't
Wait,
think
but then you
it's
have
on this
one
thing.
sleeve on one sweater, and then you can't wear it anymore.
Wait, isn't it, Mr. Carlson? Isn't it because if you had the more land you had, the more power you had? Like land was your
Well, yeah, I mean, that's
currency.
gonna
Like
be
that's
the source of your wealth, and the average person in Mexico is going to be a tenant farmer who, it looks like he's got his own shack in his own area that he's farming, but it's actually on someone else's land, and he owes a huge portion of his crop to that person. But you could say, well, they took the land. Well, I guess technically then I should lose my house. I bought it, but somewhere down the line it didn't belong to somebody. It got taken. The United States government seized it from Indians. So would it be fair if all of a sudden all of our homes and properties were given to Indians?
but the land of which it's on.
And then what am I supposed to do? Go back to the home country? I don't have a home country. You'll have to cut me into various fragments.
I'm just Polish.
No, I'm not Chinese. Yeah.
Wait, what?
Right. Hey, quiet.
Back to your previous question where you said how did they,
Everyone's African. Moving on.
the fact that they couldn't, how did they deal with the issue? Could you see that there was a redistribution of resources? Like, the other people.
Some people might have had that idea, but obviously, and this is what I said, the people who had the land and controlled the resources, they tried very hard to prevent any of that kind of redistribution. I mean, you can sit there and say you've got more than you could ever need or use. That doesn't change property rights. I mean, what makes you the decider on who deserves what and how much you need? Yeah.
They also added that it's unconstitutional to redistribute something that is rightfully.
In the United States, it would be.
Yeah,
but if you can push for reforms and it can be done legally, hey, come on, we redistribute property all the time in this country. Social Security taxes take money from my paycheck to get paid for other people's retirement. I mean, that's taking wealth from me and giving it to somebody else.
Don't you want to help other people?
So, what?
So don't you want to help other people?
No. How am I helping it if I'm being forced to do it? It's not charity if it's done at the barrel of a gun.
Technically.
And that's what taxes is at the barrel of a gun. I mean, I don't pay them voluntarily. If I get pulled over by the cops, it's not because I agree that I've committed an infraction and should get a ticket. It's because if I try to get away, bad things are going to happen. I'm definitely not escaping in my trailblazer. All right, moving on. Attempts to address poverty and the lack of education. See, these are all needs. They don't really get addressed. You have a constant push for liberal reforms and then a backlash. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna follows your model of the caudillo who rises to national power. He essentially becomes an emperor of Mexico. He suspends the Constitution of 1824, undoes the liberal reforms. That's, by the way, one reason why Texas fought for its independence. It's more complicated than that. But Santa Anna will be removed from power because he will lose a war with the United States.
Wait, Santa Anna's Santa Anna right now? Huh? California? Santa Anna? What is that?
Santa Anna just means Saint Anna. His name was Antonio Lopez. Called Santa Anna de Santa Anna. Anyways, the U.S.-Mexican War, which will erupt over a border dispute, and the fact that Mexico wouldn't sell us California, so we figured we'd take it. He'll be removed from power, and it'll go back towards more, from the conservative side, towards the more liberal, or in some cases maybe potentially radical side, because we have Benito Juarez. He was a lawyer of Indian descent. Mexican Indian descent, not Indian descent. In 1857, he puts together a new constitution, one that will limit church power. It will include land reforms, but they don't work out the way they were supposed to. Sometimes a reform, an idea, it sounds like, okay, remember the cash for clunkers? Did you guys hear about that? Yeah. Okay. The idea was that people would get rid of their gas guzzlers in exchange for some, and buy something more fuel efficient. The downside to that, what happened was some people actually went out and bought gas, like at junkyards, really cheap garbage gas guzzlers, and then exchanged them to get the money for cash for clunkers to buy themselves new cars.
But it's recycling. Why is it bad?
Huh? No, it was a scam, basically. They weren't trading in their current cars. They were intentionally going out and buying cheap garbage cars, exchanging them for more money from the government, and then using that.
But the car wasn't even, good, or, yeah.
Sometimes the effect isn't what was intended. And what happens is a bunch of speculators buy up the land that was supposed to go to sale for regular people, and prices go up, and really in the end the people that are supposed to be helped don't get help. His liberal reforms will lead to a conservative reaction. So again, we see back and forth. The French will actually intervene here. And there's the interesting story of installing Maximilian von Habsburg.
That sounds very
Emperor of
French.
Mexico. He was Austrian, from the Austrian Empire's royal family, installed by the French, meaning the French have intervened. They have replaced the elected leader, Benito Juarez, with a white Austrian emperor of Mexico. The Mexican people would not tolerate that. There's civil war. Maximilian loses and ends up in front of a firing squad. Juarez is back, and he sees his power as an autocratic leader at this point. When we talk about democracy in Mexico after this point, it's an illusion. Like I said, he'll end up being replaced with Porfirio Diaz in 1876, and Diaz he's a dictator. He runs a strong central government. Opposition forces, he roots them out and suppresses them. There are elections, and they are corrupt. They are rigged to keep getting him reelected for 32, 34 years. And it will not end until there is another civil war in Mexico. Yeah?
How did the French intervention work with the Monroe Doctrine?
The United States did not exercise the Monroe Doctrine, did not force him out. I think it might be, I honestly don't know, but I think I might remember, or it might be because he really didn't have time to do much. We are also talking about, let's see, what was the year for Maximilian's being the emperor? They got a book?
French
Check your
forces
jacket
landed
for a book.
in 1862 and took
My book.
The French forces came in 1862.
Okay, so 1860s. Why wouldn't the United States intervene to stop French involvement in Mexico?
Civil War.
We're fighting the Civil War. So,
They had their own problems.
yeah, there you go.
Didn't the book say that?
What?
Didn't the book said that? Yeah, never mind.
Next slide. Argentina. Argentina is a land of two economies. In the area around Buenos Aires, you have a very rich commercial center. A strong, wealthy merchant class. A large number of European immigrants. But out in the Pampas, in the countryside, ranching and farming. Argentine beef is, beef's a major product in Argentina to this very day. I know when I was in, I did a semester of study overseas when I was in England, and it was during the mad cow disease scare, where British beef had been tainted with mad cow disease. And so I wasn't eating beef unless it was Argentine or Australian. There was a big market for imported beef, because obviously I didn't want to get mad cow disease.
Oh yeah, we read about that in bio.
Anyways, Argentina will experience from the beginning the same conflict over a central authority or local regional powers. That's why Paraguay, Uruguay, and Bolivia will separate. You see the rise of Juan Manuel de Rosas, a populist authoritarian. Those are two words that we need to know. What's a populist do? A populist tries to appeal to the emotions of the masses. He tells the majority what they want to hear, and makes them, he sells himself as a man of the people. but he's also an authoritarian. What's an authoritarian? It's a dictator. You do it the way I said. And since he keeps telling people what they want to hear, he's got the support of the masses, so he can pull that off.
Which would be all popular.
Liberals and regional Chaldeos who resent his power will overthrow him in 1852. And this will usher in a period of relative political stability for Argentina. Now, when we talked about how political instability hurt the economy, in Argentina we can see what happens when you have political stability. Foreign investment pours in. The population triples between 1862 and 1890. Try to wrap your head around that. The population triples in 28 years. So there's a huge flux of immigration from Europe. In Argentina, you have this stability because, kind of like in Germany, you end up with the ruling class, the oligarchs, the wealthy, aligning themselves with the middle class, which means you can stave off the radicals. You can keep the radicals in the fringe. Instead of middle class uniting with radicals, that would be bad if you're a ruling class. Like Mexico, though, the Argentine government will suppress labor disputes and unrest in the regions, rural unrest. Next. Social and cultural issues. Here's a dilemma. Think of Argentina, right? Your population has tripled, largely because of European immigration. Culturally, is Latin America European, or is it Native American? Or is it a blend of both? If you were a member of the elite, you would have been more European. Your tastes, your manners, your styles, your fashions. You would have lived in a house that looked European. You'd be wearing European clothes. But if you were a common folk, you wouldn't be living the same way. Heck, you may not even speak Spanish if you're far enough out there. In the 1830s, Romanticism spread from Europe into the United States. Does anybody know why Romanticism will appeal to Latin American Indians? Yeah.
Because Romanticism was the movement of like going back to nature and away from industrialization.
Celebrating yourself. Romanticism is egotistical. But I think a good example would be this. How many of you have heard of Ralph Waldo Emerson? Ralph Waldo Emerson. Brilliant American thinker. He wrote an interesting essay. He was very critical of American art, architecture, and literature. Do you remember from our history class, Marissa, what was Emerson's complaint about early 19th century American art, literature, and architecture?
That was too emotional.
It was just a copy of British style.
Oh my God, I just said that.
I got it.
Never mind.
It's just a copy. And Emerson said, look around, America. Look around. You're not Englishmen. Why do you settle for copying English? You're never going to be as good as them if you're just copying. You have things about America to celebrate. America is unique and special. And that's when in American literature you get to return to things that celebrate the wilderness. There's no wilderness in England. And so forth. Well, that's going to appeal to the locals and the natives in Latin America. Why should we strive to be European? We have our own ancient customs, our own styles. And there's going to emerge a new interest in what it is to be, what is it to be Argentine? What is it to be Mexican? To be Mexican, is that to be a copy of the Spanish? No. Let's celebrate Mexico. So, there's a bit of nationalism tied in with that. Positivism in the 1870s. What was positivism? Yes.
Yeah. Like basing the government form off of like science.
Yes. It was very similar to what the Enlightenment said about the social sciences, but basing your system on observation. Okay? It's like a scientific observation, and that's how we should plan and enact our governments. And it will influence art, it will influence literature, and the social outlook for Latin Americans. It will play a huge role in ending slavery in Brazil, because observation of slavery, I think, tells you that slavery should be abolished. The issue of women doesn't go away. There's new opportunities that emerge slowly, but one thing with Latin American, and it's that Spanish influence, you have this sense of machismo. The man, and he's got to be tough, and sometimes if he has to be, rough on his wife, hey, she's the woman, he's the man. Was it Cabrera got in trouble a couple of years ago, right?
He hit his wife when he was drunk.
He hit his wife, he was drunk. And you might say, what an a-hole. You know what, I would say, you know what, that's a cultural thing. You're a product of your culture. Okay, and it's not as much of a no-no in that world of Latin American machismo. Heck, you don't even have to go that far back in the United States culture where you might have to, put your wife in her place. I'm looking around like we're vastly outnumbered in here, guys. I'm going to change the subject right now.
Good idea.
Socialists can't remain calm.
Because if they decide to swarm, we're in trouble. I'll hit the door and I'll trip Mo so they go after me. All right. Slaves and Indians, too. That issue doesn't go away. How do we do justice for these people who had... maybe even you weren't a slave, but your parents were slaves. That means your life is still affected by slavery. How do you undo injustice, or do you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get over it? What if the system is rigged and it doesn't even allow that? Because you're half black, or because you are descended from the Maya. What if no matter how hard you work and how hard you try, it ain't going to amount to squat? Yeah. Reagan. Yeah, I just asked a question. You got an answer?
Well, wouldn't you respond to that by, rebelling and,
Not if you don't have any money to do it.
Ultimately, it could lead to rebellion. I mean, that's what ends up happening in Cuba in the 1950s. Or you are going to push for liberal reforms. I mean, women didn't need to revolt to get the right to vote in this country. It took a long time to lay the groundwork and make the case for it, but eventually a change of mind and hearts, and women can vote. Anyways, I got to catch up. I'm behind. Let's move on. Brazil. If you go back and look over Brazil, you'll notice the same pattern of central authority versus regional power. After 1850, there's relative stability in Brazil, which means there's going to be increased economic prosperity. The rise of a merchant class, very strong one in places like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Which means slavery becomes less important to Brazil. Everywhere that slavery is abolished, conditions change first to make it less valuable. Brazil's no exception. But by 1888, slavery is abolished in Brazil, and it was the last major country to get rid of it as a major part of their economy. Don't underestimate the influence of positivism in that. The end of slavery requires a dramatic change of people's minds. So it has to be something that appeals to them on an intellectual or a moral level. 1 year after that, the monarchy gets replaced with a republic. I'd like to point that in mind. Your Republican form of government and slavery abolished in 1 year between them. For the U.S., there was like an 80-year time period in between establishing a republic and getting rid of slavery. So maybe Brazil just had some catching up to do. But like all those social and political and economic issues, they're going to stay. None of these problems go away. The issue of inequality before the law, the issue of limited access to economic opportunity. And we don't think that everybody should be rich in this country, but we think everybody should have the opportunity to work for what they have and acquire it. Huh?
Or have a chance.
They have a chance, yeah. But if the system doesn't allow you to have a chance, there's something wrong with the system. Next. Haha. It's kind of funny. In the early 19th century, Latin America gets rid of Spain. But by the end of the 19th century, there's a new bully on the block, and his name is Uncle Sam. All right. Spanish-American War, 1898. For a very, very long time, the United States Americans had wanted control over Cuba. There had actually been brief expeditions by adventurers to start a revolt in Cuba and seize it. And Southerners, before the Civil War, thought Cuba would make a great state, because you can transplant the Southern economy to Cuba perfectly. There's a lot of reasons why the United States wanted to go to war with Spain. When you have Mrs. Hall next year, maybe she'll talk about the role of yellow journalism. There are a lot of journalists. The way that the news was told to encourage it. Go figure. People use the news to manipulate what people think. Fox News. It happens. Yeah, I'll give you an example. What ended up happening was the USS Maine, it was a U.S. warship, was docked in Havana Harbor, and it blew up and sank. American men were killed, and newspapers printed it as a Spanish torpedo. The Spanish had attacked an American ship. By the way, we now know that it was an explosion within the ship and it was an accident. But the United States government used that journalism as a springboard to declare war on Spain. It's a short war. I mean, Spain by this time was not even a shadow of what it had been.
How long did the war last?
A couple of years. The United States will emerge from this as an imperial power too. This was the United States' step into global imperialism, because we take from Spain Puerto Rico, which we still have. We still have Puerto Rico. It's still an American territory. Cuba we took, but we gave Cuba its independence. What other big country did we take? We took the Philippines and eventually gave them their independence. Not from the Spanish. Which, by the way, means that the Spanish are now 100% out of the New World, and the United States has replaced any European influence as the dominant force there. You can see United States, this new policy with the Panama Canal. Panama didn't exist as a country. It was part of Colombia. Why did people want to build a canal through it? Yeah, point to Panama. Basically, you dig a giant ditch that you can put ships through across the Isthmus of Panama there, and ships can cross there instead of going all the way around Tierra del Fuego. You're cutting thousands of miles off. Just like how the Suez Canal in Egypt is going to cut off that trip around the Cape of Good Hope. The problem was Colombia did not want the United States doing it. Why not? Yeah, it's an issue of who's going to control it. The United States wants to control the Panama Canal. So what did we do since Colombia stood in our way?
You did it anyway.
We encouraged the people of Panama to revolt against Colombia. And we helped Panama gain its independence. And then the country of Panama allowed us to rebuild the canal, and it was exclusively under American jurisdiction. It was American territory. John McCain, the senator, born in the Panama Canal Zone. He could be president of the United. He could have been president of the United States. Go, wait a minute, you have to be born on American soil. Yeah, the Panama Canal Zone. That's how strong we controlled it. The United States is now the bully, kicking the door in and telling Latin Americans what to do. And it gets even worse. We'll talk in a future unit about banana republics, which is more than just a store with clothes I do not buy.
I love that store.
It's what you end up with is, remember, it's about access to raw materials. The United Fruit Company was actually one of the big players here. If a Latin American country has a democratically elected government, or any kind of government that is not friendly to U.S. business interests, the United States government intervened. And we would actually replace democratically elected leaders and set up governments that would be friendly to our companies. Oftentimes those governments did not represent the people they governed. They were run by bloodthirsty, dictators, real janks. So why would we support those guys?
Money. They supported us.
Yep, trade. The trade is good for us. It will also, but what it will do is it will lead up to resentment of Americans. And you can still hear that resentment echoed in some of the leaders in Latin America today. I just forgot his name. It was off the top of my head. He's the president of Bolivia. Or Venezuela's Hugo Chavez is always talking about the American imperialists. If the United States thinks it can go in and run other countries and tell them what to do for its own interests.
Because we do.
I don't like Hugo Chavez, but he's got a point. So anyways, but as the 20th century emerges, Latin America is pretty much under the thumb of the United States in many respects. They've replaced one tyrant and gotten